And then we can, fast forward to the more recent arrivals. We've heard brief reference to 1999 and the arrival of 4 boats from Fujian province. More recently, 2009, the Ocean Lady, 76 Tamils. 2010, 492 Tamils from Sri Lanka, and all of a sudden we're in major panic mode. I just think there's a thread here that deserves underscoring, and it's a fairly consistent one. Canada has had a kind of ebb and flow response when it comes to refugees right from the get-go. We have this kind of reputation as being an open, welcoming country, a country that, for example, was lauded internationally, received the Nansen Medal in recognition of pretty incredible resettlement efforts in response to the Indo-Chinese crisis many, many years ago. But at the same time, we refused to sign on to the 1951 Refugee Convention when it was first adopted because we had security concerns about refugees coming to Canada. We were very reluctant to sign on. It took years, in fact, before Canada adopted the convention. So it's important to keep that in mind as context. Now, I want to get, I guess, to the heart of what our policy response should be around refugees arriving by boat, using the most recent example of the MV Sun Sea. But really, I hope presenting a response that's broader than just dealing with this one problem. And I think, a number of speakers have already touched on policy responses, but let me suggest they kind of fall into, so far, 2 major paradigms that kind of dominate discourse around what our policy responses should be. On the one hand, there's the law and order organized crime response, right? These people have come via human smugglers. This is organized crime. We've got to stamp those networks out. And we've got to make sure that nobody else comes to Canada with the assistance of smugglers, right? And it's a law and order kind of response. So among the proposals currently under consideration apparently are tougher penalties for smugglers. Now, you'll probably be interested to know that smuggling is already criminalized in Canada, as is trafficking, and indeed quite severely. Anyone who is found guilty of organizing a group of 10 or more people to come to Canada through smuggling activity is liable to life imprisonment, a $1 million fine, or both. Okay, so that's pretty severe already. I would say, and apparently our government is among the responses as a result of this recent arrival of 492 Tamils, we want to increase the penalties, make them worse. What are we going to do? Impose mandatory minimum sentences. So right now, judges have discretion, if they have a smuggling case before them, not to impose that sentence, right? It's among the arsenal they have, but they may choose, based on the individual circumstances of the case, that a person doesn't really deserve life imprisonment. Maybe because they weren't the ringleader. And let's face it, the ringleaders, in terms of these smuggling networks, are never on the boats, right? They're already back where they came from, absolutely invisible. The likelihood that Canada will ever prosecute somebody who was seriously involved in a smuggling or trafficking network, almost next to nil, right, in terms of prosecution on Canadian soil. So we can adopt all of the, lovely draconian offenses that we want in our Canadian law. I would argue they're not really going to be much more than window dressing. But in any event, we have pretty severe offenses in law already. And so I would suggest to Mr. Harper that he discard, any further thought of more law and order responses to the problem of smuggling. That's just my opinion. The other response is the migration control response, right? So we've heard a lot of talk about that. Among the measures being considered as an appropriate policy response to these boats are, making sure they never leave the region. So suggestions that we should somehow collaborate with Thailand or India and make sure that if there are refugees coming from Sri Lanka, they go to Thailand or India, but not Canada. That was one possibility. Another possibility is intercepting the boats on the high seas. That's definitely being considered. And otherwise, if they do arrive in Canada, making sure that they're not welcome to come into our asylum determination system whatsoever. We either send them back where they came from, put them all in detention, and then deport them. Right? So, I mean, we've heard a little bit less of that suggestion, but it's been there if you've been reading recent media. All of these so-called responses really fall into the migration control paradigm, and arguably are equally problematic. I don't have time to necessarily just deconstruct all of it in detail, but let's just say in a nutshell, we know already that India and Thailand are not signatory to the Refugee Convention. They don't have any obligations to accept refugees. It's true that thousands of Sri Lankan Tamils have gone to India over the years during the protracted civil war. What kind of circumstances have they faced in India? Quasi-detention, severe restrictions of movement, generations of people actually living in camp-like situations with no ability to get on with their lives, to settle, access to education extremely limited, no right to work in India, etc. So, you know, unless, and would India be likely to make some agreement with Canada to accept more Tamil refugees from Sri Lanka? Not very likely. So not very realistic. And indeed, whenever, you know, we have an opportunity to talk with colleagues in India about why India isn't a signatory to the Refugee Convention, we often get a very strong response. Well, you know, India's done a lot for refugees, but we don't want to be part of the international regime, and there's a lot of reasons for it, which if you're interested, we can talk about in the discussion period. Thailand, a country known for turning back boatloads of refugees from Myanmar, right? And, you know, members of an ethnic minority, strong evidence of persecution. Thai authorities send the boats out to sea and let them go. You know, so we're not talking about a country with a very good track record. So I'm just suggesting briefly that the so-called regional solution of somehow keeping the Tamil refugees in the region is not very practical in the circumstances of Sri Lanka. Interception on the high seas, well, Canada is a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention, right? Now, under that convention, it doesn't necessarily inhibit us from intercepting boats bound for Canada, but what it does impose upon us very clearly is an obligation to ensure that we are not responsible for sending anyone back to a country where they're at risk of persecution. So if we wanted to intercept a boat on the high seas, if, you know, as has been suggested, that this boat should have been intercepted long before it reached the west coast of Canada, we would still have an obligation to ensure that every individual on that boat had access to an asylum interview, whether it was provided by ourselves, the UNHCR, or a third party, right? And these kinds of arrangements are not very easily struck. It's in fact arguably much easier if Canada waits for boats to come and provides people due process here in Canada. The system's already set up. And it's not as though we're being inundated by boats. I mean, let's keep in mind, I've actually given you the highlights of the boats that have arrived over, you know, almost the last 100 years. We're not a country that receives all that many boats of migrants, interestingly enough. So, we talked about kind of these migration control policy responses. I really want to pick up on what Jennifer spoke about in terms of source country class as an option. It's interesting because you don't get, what your brief extract from the CIC website didn't tell you is that that class right now is only an option for refugees from the DRC, Sudan, El Salvador, Guatemala, Colombia, and Sierra Leone. It's a very small handful of countries. When you go to the website, it actually looks like, oh, this is great. This looks like this is an option for anybody who might be at risk and needs to get out, and Canada is willing to help. But in fact, this access to the source country class is extremely limited to just this handful of countries. Arguably, if it was expanded, that would be an appropriate policy response in the name of migration control still, because what it's saying is, we don't want people to self-select and come to Canada. We would prefer to do our picking and choosing at the source, right? So it's still about control. It's about controlling who gets in and having greater say. The problem, of course, with it is that not every genuine refugee is going to be able to contact a Canadian embassy in their country of origin. It may be a realistic option for some refugees, but it's certainly not a realistic option for many. And so I would argue that's why Canada has a multi-pronged refugee program. In other words, our program is operating exactly as it should. We have a source country class option, which arguably should be expanded, but can't exist in isolation. We have the possibility of resettlement from a third country, right, for those people who can actually get to a third country. But we know in the case of the island nation of Sri Lanka that that's not so realistic an option in that particular case. And then we have the refugee determination system, the so-called self-selected program, for everybody else who can't access one of those options. So I would tell Mr. Harper, you know what? Law and order may have its place, migration control has its place, but in terms of boats of refugee claimants, everything is working the way it should. Are there security risks aboard this boat? And the last one, it remains to be seen. But if there are, I'm confident they'll be addressed. And I guess that, in a nutshell, is what I wanted to put forward today, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.